Well, good afternoon or good morning or good evening for some of you. I'd like to say thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Marty Park, this morning or today for our webinar. And it's all around the idea of mindset. And before I introduce my guest today, I want to just give a little bit of background. First, a couple quick things. For all of the participants, we've had about 140 or 150 people register. And so we can't see everybody and we can't hear you, but we would like, if you've got questions or comments, that you can use the chat. We're going to use the chat feature to be able to provide links to things so that you can click directly from here, the webinar, out to the web page or wherever we want to send you. And so that's a little bit of the informal side of things, but we'd like to interactiveness with you. This event was really important to me, and it came about really from the idea that we had just finished off an 8-week live session around sales. And the first week was really around the mindset of sales and some of the successful mindset components that really play into business, but leak out into just personal success. And we had so much incredible feedback from that we really thought, okay, mindset's got to be something that we maybe delve into. And the first few chapters of my book, the first 8 chapters, I think, are all around mindset of an entrepreneur. And so most of our audience today are business owners, entrepreneurs, management, and I think a few people that I would just qualify with a lot of the audience that I know, just high performers in their given area. And so it's a great audience for this. We spend a lot of time on mindset in our business and also in Gina's. And I think what I'd like to be able to do is we've tried to hit on things that are practical here and just cover a gamut. Now, there's an awful lot of material, so I'm going to introduce Gina and we're going to get rolling. So Dr. Gina Gulio is in Toronto today, and she's the owner of Pathwell. And so Pathwell specializes in personal and corporate mental wellness. And so Gina's a clinical psychologist. She's been clinical psychologist for over 10 years, and she works with business leaders, entrepreneurs, business owners, and again, just people that are looking for better performance and better health in their mental well-being. And so Gina, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
It's nice to see you. I wanted to maybe dive into, I guess, maybe the framework or just some basic things before we get into, I guess, sort of the things people might do. One of the things that I thought was really interesting for me is the idea that the mind is trainable. And I think this is something that I've seen with my clients from a coaching standpoint, but I imagine you see pretty often, is that people sort of think that almost the old, I can't teach a dog new tricks, that there's some element of at my age, it's set, or that this is the way I think. But I've always found this idea of the mind being trainable is really the place it creates opportunity for me. And how do you approach that with your clients?
Yeah, I think that's, one of the biggest misconceptions about the mind, right? Is that the mind is fixed. And, this was thought to be true even in the scientific community not that long ago. Like when I went to school, I was in grad school, we learned that, when you're born with a certain number of neurons and brain cells that begin to, start to die off the moment that you're born, right? And there's things that you can do to slow that process down. But, you got the neurons that you got, and that's it. We know now from science that that's just not true. So the mind, we say, is malleable. You can learn to change your mindset, and you can grow new neuronal pathways, make new connections. You can literally change your brain at any age. This idea, old dog can't teach new tricks is just not true. There have been, research studies that have looked at sort of brain changes that have been rendered possible in centenarians. Okay, so this is possible at any age, anytime you can change your brain. The only thing you need is, of course, the will to do so, and the willingness to put in the work that's required to do so.
And the thing I love about that is that if I recognize now that my brain isn't stuck in the patterns of thinking I have, that it also means that my future isn't stuck, that new opportunities or new possibilities or new directions can come from that new thinking. So I've always found that idea of the brain being trainable is that no matter what my age or where I'm at in my career or where the business is at, that all of these things, there's great opportunity in the future if I'm open to the idea of training my mind.
Right. That's
you
right.
touched on.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and successful people know that, right? They know that the mind is not fixed. They know that they can change. They're excited by that change, right? As long as, again, you have the willingness to do so, you can change your mindset at any time.
One of the things you touched on was the idea of you're born with sort of a certain, setup, and that's what you've got, maybe on a declining scale. But I love that idea when you mentioned being born. I think it ties in also to the mindset idea that some people are just born as natural business people or born as an entrepreneur, right? That it's sort of a skill set you're given, and either you've got it or you don't. But this sort of implies for a lot of our audience too, that the ability to continue to develop their mindset around as a business person or as an entrepreneur, it has got an open end of success to it too.
Right. Yeah, I think that's another misconception, right? That entrepreneurs are born. Entrepreneurs are not born. Leaders are not born. They're bred, right? There's no sort of set of, characteristics that you can line up and say, if you've got A, B, C, D, you are a natural born entrepreneur. No. There are some skills, yes, and behaviors that are associated with being a successful leader and being a successful entrepreneur. But those skills and behaviors are given rise to by a mindset. Okay. I say all the time, entrepreneurship is a mindset. It's not a personality construct. And you can learn that mindset at any time. Anyone can be an entrepreneur as long as they learn the right mindset that's required to be one.
Yeah, I love that. I like that, just to reinforce that for everybody in the audience. I think one of the things we're really talking about today is the idea of, and what I really think about mindset is the first step of being conscious of starting to think about my thinking, right? That so often we are going through the steps of our daily life and our routines, or we've built it into a habit, or we're taking the approach of that we're just not, becoming conscious of like, how am I thinking about my problems, my challenges, my opportunities, my where I can improve. That I really want to push this idea of thinking about your thinking and becoming conscious with it. Is there a way that you sometimes ask people to do that, or is there any approach that people can take with that?
Yeah, I mean, clinically, there's a way, and I'm sure in your work too, just asking certain questions, right? It's kind of what you do in sales, right? You let the other person talk. There's some open-ended questions that you can ask. Sometimes, I'll ask clients for homework to write some of their thoughts down. So, for example, when they feel, let's say they're thinking of starting a business, but they feel afraid. So I say, well, every time you have like a thought around self-doubt, write that thought down. What was the trigger and what exactly was that thought, right? So we can start to delve into any limiting mindsets or sabotaging thoughts that might be getting in the way of a person's success. But so I think for me in my work, it's twofold. It's asking the right set of kind of open-ended questions, but getting people to just stop and be more self-aware of their own thinking as well.
I like the idea too that one of the things we do from a business standpoint when we're talking to people about whether it's sales or service, we often record that. And I find much like recording somebody where they now can see themselves swing a golf club or go down a ski hill or do anything where they've got that videotape to see sort of outside themselves. I found that recording phone work, recording meetings, you often hear in your language cues that sort of indicate where you have limitation, or where this is where people use, they're even making some effort. Well, we're going to try. And they look at, oh, maybe I haven't made a decision on that. Or they look and they get a sense of where they're struggling. So I always like that idea of being able to record, whether it's in a journal or video, but getting some record of the things you're saying and maybe the things you're actually thinking is a great way to start to become conscious of that.
For sure. And we know that, if you just ask somebody to remember what they might have been thinking, in a situation, that's not really accurate, right? Retrospective ratings aren't accurate. We know that. So getting people to record in real time, like when they feel triggered, when they're having a certain, maybe self-limiting thought, getting them to record that in real time is important. And it's much more effective in terms of then, changing that mindset.
Okay. So let's move on and talk a little bit about sort of a framework. And what I like is that people have sort of a common language, or think about some of the goalposts, so to speak, on the sides of the box for them. I mean, we talk about the brain not being plastic and actually being something malleable that you can really, the same way you build up the muscle in your arm, you have the ability to improve that and work it and redefine those neural pathways. And therefore, the behaviors that come from that, the actions, and often the outcomes that come from it. In learning those mindsets, one of the things that I thought that's also interesting is outside of directly mindset is recognizing, and this for me as a business guy was difficult. I've always been about the think, but oftentimes the two variants between there's a recognition of feelings and the emotion that comes with that, whether it's in business, whether it's the nervousness of doing a webinar, it's sales, but also that there's a real balance there that I've found that for me, mindset is getting clear on sort of my head, but also connecting that again to my gut and balancing out, well, how am I feeling about this and how am I thinking about it, and recognizing those can sometimes be two different answers.
Right. And as a clinician, helping people to be aware, right? If even just, it sounds simple, but what's a feeling and what's a thought? You'd be surprised at how many people have difficulties with that, right? Because we say things like, I feel scared, right? That's not a feeling, that's a thought, right? And so just getting people to be more aware of what's what and the interconnection between the two, of course, right? How we feel affects our thinking and vice versa, right? What we think then is going to affect how we feel emotionally. So getting people to separate the two, first of all, clinically is important, and then getting to them to realize the intersection between the two, how one kind of feeds the other, and how one can sometimes sabotage the other as well in business, is really important to highlight that to them.
I've seen this with the idea of somebody doing a presentation to their team where they're going to stand up in front of 20 staff, and they say, well, I think I'm ready. And they think from the perspective of, I've done the rehearsal, we've got the technology all set up, and they've gone through sort of the logical side of it. And where they really struggle in terms of performance is sometimes well, how are you feeling about this? Are you feeling confident? No. And being able to dig into that. So I always think that, you're right, the alignment of making sure that the thinking side, which is so obvious that people use the thinking piece in business, but they don't always use that feeling piece as well. And I'm the first to say that I used to believe that, the more you're a machine in business, the better off you are. And I've moved back on that continuum to recognize that the way I feel about every time I'm presenting, I'm selling, I'm just having a conversation with team, I'm envisioning the business, that feel is such an important piece of that. And we have to respect it and really dive into that.
Yeah, emotional intelligence, right? Big buzzword right now, right? That's part of it, right? So it's being aware not just of your thinking, but your feeling as well, right? Rendering thoughts and emotions into sort of the realm of consciousness. And I think historically emotions have also gotten, a bad rap, especially in business, right? Business was thought to be something that is, dispassionate, and to feel emotional about something, especially the emotions that have a bit of a negative connotations associated with them, right? Like fear, right? Anxiety, that was thought to be a weakness in business. And it's really not. What I teach my business leaders is, emotions can actually serve you well. And if you really attend to them and be present with them, can be sort of beacons for what's important to focus on, right? And for sure. And we know that leaders that are emotionally intelligent, in the sense that they're able to do that well, are more successful in business as well. So emotions give people a competitive edge. They are not a weakness. That's another one of the biggest misconceptions, I would say, in business.
Yeah, I found it the more, and this to me has been a conscious practice where I literally check in with how do I feel about this more often in making decisions. I go back to Brene Brown and all of her work around vulnerability. And I've often, again, thought standing as the owner of the business or talking to my team that I had to seem invincible. But in my experience, if I can be able to say, this is where I want to go and here's our plan, I have some clarity that way. But being able to speak about my own vulnerability, about how I'm stressed about this, or I'm challenged by this, and try and pull people around me in. And in my personal life, it's the same thing, talking to friends and family about here's my vulnerability, and that it actually creates an opportunity for other people to get involved in your success. And it's been a great learning for me that demonstrating that vulnerability actually really creates connection and team in a business, but also even in your personal life.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And showing that vulnerability, being courageous enough, right, to be vulnerable in that way will also render, you as a leader much more authentic to other people and therefore more trustworthy, right? We know that people who see their leaders as authentic are more trustworthy. And we also know that employees will work much harder for a leader that they think is authentic and is vulnerable as well. So again, that not a sign of weakness as we used to sometimes think in business. It's a real strength.
Yeah, and I agree. There's been a real shift society-wise, but certainly in the business community. And I'll touch on that sort of shift even when we talk about meditation later. One of the things and this has been something that I'll say has been a real challenge for me in my whole business career, and certainly as a business owner, the pressure you put on yourself to succeed has been judgment, right? And I really like your take on this, because I used to think that the results I was getting was really like, I'm doing a good job with this, it's a bad job with that, I'm failing at this, I'm succeeding at this, and everything was a measure of sort of like, again, from this place of judging the results. And now I go back to much more neutral, and I found this to be much more effective. And I always advise it with clients, like, okay, are we getting the results we want or aren't we? And that's really what it is. But the good, the bad, the wrong, the right is really subjective. How do you address that with people when they come to you and start to recognize that self-judgment?
Yeah, I think self-judgment is one of the sabotaging mindsets, really, right? So it's a behavior, but it's fed by judgment. So we'd have to break that down a bit more. So what's feeding that judgment? Is it maybe some standards of perfectionism, right, that you might have for yourself? Is it a set of unrelenting standards, right, that you hold yourself to? So we would have to uncover exactly where that judgment is coming from. And teach people, what I do is also teach people how to challenge that objectively, right? Because otherwise, it creates this almost like you're chasing something that doesn't exist, right? You end up chasing perfectionism, and it's also not fun, right? Something is either good or bad. It's you're successful or not, you're a failure or not. Business is just not that black and white either, right? And successful business people know that, right? So we'd want to help people move away from those, what I call that all or nothing thinking, that can be really limiting and get in the way of success.
And I love one of the phrases I've adopted, that is the idea of the story I'm telling about this. The story I'm telling about this is recognizing that my reality in a situation in the office or in my business or with a client may be very different than theirs, right? You have a conversation and my takeaway from it saying, that was a great conversation, and you leave it going, that was terrible. And so I was like, that I feel like if I start my version of things with the story I'm telling about this it helps me remember that, oh yeah, this is my reality, and there can be a little less judgment with that. I think that for me, that also leads into the idea that when we talk about success, or we talk about recognizing the results of things, it's also, there's some honesty there. And I think it's this idea of the appearance of success, right? That I see in business people, sometimes that idea of, well, I've got to look successful versus the difference of be successful, right? And I love Instagram because there's always no shortage of somebody standing in front of the Learjet, and they've got their Lamborghini, and and you're like, I'm not sure that that's the person's daily life. So is there anything that you do to help people sort of recognize what true success looks like, or how they measure that, or how they define it?
Sure. Well, first is providing them some education, right? We know that we'll call them the toys, right? The trappings sometimes of success do not buy people happiness, right? They might temporarily, but really it's that type of happiness that those things bring. It's really fleeting. So first is, I think, working with people to redefine, if necessary, their definition of success, right? Success is not, getting the fancy Lamborghini. It's not, the Lear jet, but I sometimes need to work with people to ensure that they're defining success through intrinsic standards, right? And intrinsic measures, right? So making that shift sometimes is really important, because we know that if you as a business leader, entrepreneur, are driven by those external motivating factors, that's not going to work out really well for you, right? That's not going to be enough to sustain everything that you have to do and the hard work that's required to be a business leader and an effective entrepreneur, right? You have to be driven by internal motivating factors and redefine success along those measures as well.
That as you described that, it reminds me of a situation where some people may know I was in the restaurant business for a long time. So I was 19 years in the restaurant and bar business. And in that, the combination of the story we tell and this appearance of success, there was a couple of, not far from my office here, there was a couple of restaurants where I sort of knew my numbers, I knew the metrics of the industry. And for weeks and months I walked by and I didn't know, I thought, how are they being so successful? I look at the number of covers they do or the number of people they have in at lunch, and there's no way these guys could be staying in business. And I looked down the other street and I thought, the math of what these guys should be paying in rent, like there's no way these guys should be making money. And month after month, they stayed in business. And I really got to this place of, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. The story I'm telling is I'm good at the restaurant business, but I'm not. I mean, there must be some secret that every other business here on the street knows that I don't. And it really shook my confidence and my thinking. And what I recognized one day as I walked by and both businesses had put up brown paper on the windows and had a note saying we're no longer going to be open, was that I realized, sometimes the perception of somebody else is always doing it better than you isn't true. And I think this is absolutely true for entrepreneurs, that everybody's struggling with something in their business. And oftentimes, you walk by the retail and it's all glossy and bright in the window, but that's not probably how it is in the back office. But that experience of seeing somebody where I really shook my confidence in my own business abilities, and then realized for 6 months, I've been telling this story that they must be doing something right and I'm doing something wrong, was really a bit of a wake-up call for me to think about, how am I thinking about my business and my success relative to other people? And,
right.
And I think that's a good lesson. Do you ever find that there's a lot of comparison going on when you're talking to business leaders?
Absolutely. And social media, there's pros and cons associated to it. One of the cons is that, it can set people up, right, or present this stage of sort of comparing yourself to other people. And I say, you're comparing yourself to the filtered life, right? Literally, right? Instagram, it's the filtered life, because people present little snapshot versions of, their best selves, and nobody really posts, hey, I'm having, a terrible day today, or I didn't meet my sales quota, this month, right? Nobody does, right? Nobody posts that stuff. So it's all the, the smoke and mirrors, everything, looks fabulous. So, but successful business people, entrepreneurs, they know just how dangerous that comparison to others is. And they don't do that, right? The only people that they compare themselves to is themselves.
Yeah. And I love that that comparison on an ongoing basis with everybody else in your business or in your personal life really robs you of any joy or satisfaction of the things you have created.
Absolutely.
When we talk about sort of characteristics of a good mindset, you helped me put together a really great list. And I thought there's some specific characteristics that go into this. And one of the first ones you brought up was the idea of resiliency. And can you why is that important?
Yeah, I mean, resilience is another big buzzword, right, that we've heard in the past couple of years. So what does this mean, and why is it so important for a business leader to be? Well, resilience, first of all, let me define it. I'll tell you what it is, and maybe more importantly, what it isn't. So sometimes people think that, a resilient business person is one who doesn't get stressed and is mentally tough and just can weather anything. And that's not really true. So resilient people feel everything that less resilient people feel. So resilient people feel scared, frustrated, angry, afraid, what have you. But what they do well is that they're really well able to cope with those emotions. And they don't let how they feel negatively dictate what they do. Okay, so that's the definition of resilience. It's not not feeling negative emotions. It's not having bad things or challenges happen to you. It's knowing what to do in the face of those challenges.
Thank you for that. I think that's a great understanding of what that means. And it's not bulletproof. It's the idea that, you're not bulletproof and you can feel the bullets, but you have some awareness or some element of way to weather that. Right. Self-awareness was something else that you brought up. I always think that this is funny because most of the time when you talk to people, everybody is self-aware. So how do you identify? It's like everybody's a good driver.
If you say that, you're not self-aware.
Right, exactly. Like, look how self-aware I am. It's like, clearly, yeah.
Look how unaware I am. I'm not reading the signs, right? People in the room, their eyes are glazing over.
So how does somebody become more self-aware? Are there any, that's obviously a skill, but is there any approach to that?
Yeah, well, that's really what, being emotionally intelligent means, right? Being emotionally intelligent means being incredibly self-aware. What does that mean? It's knowing your strengths, right? It's knowing your limitations. It's being able to, read a room, take the temperature of the people around you. It's the ability to see things through other people's point of view, even though you might disagree with them, right? So it's empathy. So it's being incredibly self-aware of one's thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and understanding of others as well. That's emotional intelligence. Now, what we know about emotional intelligence is that it is not a fixed intelligence, right? So in other words, anyone can learn how to be emotionally intelligent because it's a mind construct. It's a mindset that can be learned and taught, again, at any age.
Right. Is there, and you just touched on this idea of fixed mindset. What's the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset? Because I've heard that before. How does that fit into the idea that we can all be, if everybody has the ability to grow their mindset or expand their capabilities, what is that, those two distinctions?
What do they mean? Okay, so these terms were popularized by Carol Dweck. So she separated mindsets into two: fixed versus growth. Somebody with a fixed mindset will believe that intelligence is fixed, that it's something that you're either born with or not born with at all. You're either smart or you're not. That you're sort of given the cards that you're dealt at birth. And there's not much else you can do about it. In the face of challenges, people with a fixed mindset will feel that maybe there's nothing much that they can do about the situation. So they tend to feel not intrinsically motivated, or they don't have this internal locus of control in order to change things. They attribute change to things that are external to them, right? So they're either going to work out or they're not. There's not much I can do about it. As opposed to somebody with a growth mindset, which is somebody who understands that mindsets can change. They understand that they themselves have the ability to change their thinking at any time. When faced with challenges, somebody with a growth mindset is going to frame that as an opportunity as opposed to an obstacle. That's what somebody with a fixed mindset would say. Right. And they're excited by challenges because they understand that through challenges, that's how we grow as people, and that's how we continue to change and develop in terms of our mindset.
It's interesting. That reminds me of just my kids, where sometimes they try something once and then it's like, I'm not trying, I can't do it. And right. I think that's always a great example of me as a parent trying to say, no, this is a practice thing. Like, you can get better at it, you can succeed at it, versus the tried it once, it didn't work, let's stop. But you see that same thing in business all the time, where people have tried a marketing tactic. We tried it once, it didn't work, we've given up on all of that.
Right. Right.
Gina, let me ask you, one of the characteristics you brought up next was the idea of thinking big or visualizing success. Just for me was the question of how big is big? There's always like, do I have to think about a be able to think world domination to be thinking big? Is there a bar there that we set when we talk about thinking big, or that ability?
Sure. So entrepreneurs, right, they think big, but they're also realistic, right? In doing so, they're able to think small sometimes when required, when it makes sense to do so, right? So thinking big means that, not necessarily, well, the sky's the limit, but they know that they can achieve big or great things if they put in the effort in order to do so, right? So whereas, again, somebody with maybe a more fixed mindset would say, well, I don't know, I was a B student in school, so this will be good enough. This is all I can do. People with a growth mindset, entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, know that they can push themselves even to their highest abilities with some effort.
That's great. One of the things I thought was interesting, and I want to talk more about visualization a little later, but we touched on one of the characteristics being to be able to visualize success in that thinking big. But one of the things you said was that also people that are successful oftentimes can visualize patterns or trends when they're seeing. So they visualize not only their own situation, but they can see out, whether it be in society or in their marketplace, and see trends and patterns. How do you develop that, or why is that important?
Yeah, successful entrepreneurs do this really well. So I think of, sometimes entrepreneurship as like a game of chess, right? Where an entrepreneur is, seated at the table across from their opponent, and they are present and sort of mindful of what they're doing and their next move. And they're trying to anticipate their opponent's move too. But they're always 3 steps ahead of the person across from them the table, right? And not only 3 steps ahead of that person, but they're also able to think ahead and project trends, see where, their business is going. They're able to think outside of the box. And again, that is a mindset that with some, good coaching can also be learned.
Okay. And that's, I always think the idea, if it can be learned, just provides me with a feeling of hope for being able to get better in the future. Right. Now this is one where we had said, next thing was the idea of they aren't afraid to fail, which I think sometimes people hear and they think like, entrepreneurs or successful performers like failure, but it's not so much it's just a willingness to be able to say, I'm going to get in there and I'm not afraid to fail, and that it's going to stop me from getting in the game or from taking some risk and trying it. But would you agree there's a big distinction between enjoying failure and just not being afraid of it?
Entrepreneurs understand, right, that there's no such thing as failure, because if something doesn't work out as you had hoped, what entrepreneurs do very well is they learn from that experience. And if you learn from an experience, then by definition, it's not a failure, right? Because then that learning that you glean from that experience is then going to help you, determine your next step, or it will render you, better for the next thing that you do. So if you learn something from experiences, then again, by definition, there's no such thing as failure. And entrepreneurs, successful ones, know this very well, which enables them to better take risks, right? And take more risks, which are required for success. Right? In order to be successful, you have to take risks. But in order to take a risk, you must not fear failure. And you have to know and trust yourself that whatever happens, right, you'll learn from it. And importantly, that you'll be able to cope with the outcome of whatever happens as well.
I love the idea that this to me comes back to that non-judgment, that I'm not right or wrong, fail or success. That sometimes, I had this conversation with somebody probably 6 weeks ago where I'd said, so, how long has it taken you to get to this point? They said, well, 3 years. I was like, well, what have you been doing for 3 years? And they said, well, I don't know. I was just trying different things to try and figure out how to make it work. And I thought that answer of like this idea in those 3 years, at no point did they think, oh, I've been failing for 3 years. They were just trying to rework it and rework their approach until they got the desired outcome. And I really thought they were sort of unaware of this idea. They never personally put that label on themselves. And I thought that's one of the reasons after that 3 years of persistence, they were successful, because they never got into this mindset or this language of like, I just keep failing.
Right.
One of the things I struggle with this a little bit, of this idea of finding joy in the process or the process versus outcome. Is there a way that you sometimes guide people to do that? I'm naturally kind of wired to outcome. And I think this is a challenge for a lot of business owners, or that idea of like, you hit the outcome and then you go on to the next thing. And you're not necessarily finding that joy or enjoyment of all the steps in the actual process of creating those things. Any tips around that?
Right. So, this is can be a great lesson to entrepreneurs. And yes, entrepreneurs, business leaders can be, for the most part, tend to be very goal-oriented people, right? Very goal-oriented, action-oriented. And so, it would make sense that they would sometimes, measure success based on whether or not they met certain outcomes. But you're right in that if that is the mindset, right? If you're just focusing on outcomes as a determinant of whether or not you're successful, we know that doesn't lead to happiness or enjoyment over time. Because what tends to happen, especially with people who are very goal oriented, is, okay, they meet the goal, right? So outcome met.
Right.
And then very quickly they're on to the next thing. Okay, what am I going to do next, right? Or they dismiss the fact that they met their goal, right? Or they minimize it. Or what ends up happening is they end up sort of moving the goalposts of what they think success is, right? Oh, I hit $1 million and that was my goal. You know what? Now, maybe I should hit 2. Forget about that. Okay, I'm going to hit 2, right? And then 2 becomes 3. And then they end up chasing, right, this outcome that just perpetually can go on and on forever, right? So, and it does take away, as you said, from the enjoyment of the process, which is so important as a business leader, as an entrepreneur. You have to be able to be mindful, be present, slow down, and enjoy the process. Say entrepreneurship, it's truly, it truly is about the journey, not the destination.
One of the things I've done personally, and I think I've tied this more, and I profess this with clients, is actually when in finding small outcomes, instead of worrying about the big goal of, maybe the next revenue target for the business, but breaking things down and creating rewards. And this comes back to, I remember a sales guy who I knew, where every time he got a big client over a certain dollar figure, he went and bought himself a custom golf club, in hopes that, through the course of 12 or 15 sales, he'd have an entire set of custom golf clubs. But it taught me a little reward of, whether it be get a sale or celebration with your team. But I found that setting up a culture and a cycle of creating reward really helps with sort of, the celebration makes the process and the path that you're on much more enjoyable. Because you're right, eventually when you get to that goal, sometimes if you're only focused on that end item, it's sort of from my experience, launching a book. Launched a book, Amazon bestseller, woohoo! And then it was Monday again. And it was like, okay, well, that was,
now what?
You have to celebrate the years it took to write it all and all that process, and be enjoying some of that, because the moment of it was just a moment. Gina, is there, when we talk about languages, challenges, opportunities, problems, is there a word that you like to use in there when you're guiding people to say, here, really think of it this way?
So the first 2, challenges and opportunities, especially opportunities. I've been using that word a lot this past year in this pandemic, right? So teach people look for, okay, we're, in this horrible situation. What are the opportunities here, right? So looking for opportunities in challenges, as opposed to problems. Problems just has this, negative connotation, right, associated with it. Problem implies, something, negative that needs to be fixed, as opposed to, a challenge or an opportunity you don't have to, fix anything necessarily, but those are things that you go through, as opposed to this idea that, a problem is something that you have to get over, right? And we know that it's only when you go through things that's how you grow and develop and improve as a person, right? So even just being mindful of the language that people are using when they're faced with, maybe an unusual situation is important, right? So framing them as challenges and then looking for the opportunities.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. There's a couple that, and I want to move through a couple of these because I think they're fairly straightforward, but like three of the other words we agreed were creative, optimistic, curious, right? A couple of the things that people had as just positive characteristics. Are those, again, things that you think people can practice and work on, or is it just you're naturally creative or you're naturally optimistic?
Yeah, 100%. We know that, sort of take optimism as an example. This can be learned because optimism as well, as opposed to also taking risks, etc. It's a mindset. It's a mindset. And we know we can't, there have been studied. There's a whole department at Harvard that looks at this, that optimism, right? They have a happiness lab. And this is what they do. They research optimism and they teach people how to be optimistic. And they've shown time and time again that you can take somebody with a bit more of a pessimistic / negative mindset and turn them into someone with an optimistic mindset, right? So it is truly something that can be learned.
So that's true too. I mean, if you're a business owner or an entrepreneur where you've got staff, is that something where you can be able to then say, well, here, we can bring some of our people along, or we can create sort of happy, smiley people? Or, I guess, is that something that you would encourage then to be focusing on and be able to, the potential to develop that within a team of people?
Absolutely. I mean, this is part of the work that we do at Pathwell, right? We help teams with this. So we start with leaders, right? So first, because it's really up to the leader to model this mindset and consequently behaviors that flow from that mindset to their team members, right? It can absolutely, and there are, we don't have time today. I could do a whole webinar on this as to exactly how this is done, but there are, empirically validated tools and techniques that you can teach entire teams to do in order to be more optimistic. And we know that leaders, teams that are more optimistic are more successful. Mm-hmm. We know that. And just, optimism sometimes is also a misunderstood construct. So optimism doesn't mean positivity. Like those two are actually quite different. So thinking positively, is looking through the world through rose-colored lenses, which isn't actually accurate thinking. I always say, it's just as erroneous as thinking negatively. It just looks nicer. It's packaged nicer.
The boat is sinking.
It's still erroneous. Yeah, woo! We're going to be okay, right? No. Optimistic people are realistic people. They know how to think objectively. And going back to problems, they don't see problems, they see challenges, and they trust themselves to be able to overcome them. That's optimism.
That's great. No, I love that. Thank you. We talked, the last couple of words, we talked about tolerating uncertainty and ambiguity, but I want to just jump over that. And I want to talk a little bit about deep sense of purpose and how that ties into mindset and performance of mindset. What's the connection in your experience with that, having a deep sense of purpose in your work or in your life that is so effective to a good mindset and then the results you get?
Yeah, this one is so important. Something that I work with all of my leaders, entrepreneurs with, right? It's getting them to identify what is their purpose. In other words, why are they doing what they are doing, right? Sinek calls this the knowing your why, right? So because the why, or what drives you, is what is going to enable you to persevere as an entrepreneur, as a business leader. It's not easy, right? Entrepreneurship can be tough, and it's definitely a long game. And if you're motivated again by those, external things like, the car, the house, or money, that is not going to enable you to sustain the marathon that is entrepreneurship, right? You have to be driven by this deep sense of purpose. And that purpose, by the way, has to be bigger than you. It has to be bigger than you. So you're an entrepreneur. You have to really, truly believe in your heart of hearts that your product, your service is going to make the world a better place, that it's going to, help to improve people's lives. And you need to be driven by that, right? Because that's what's going to keep you going when the going gets tough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that ties to one of our practices of visualization, and we'll move to that in a sec. But I have to mention the story, and this has been a profound thing. Dealing with the gentleman, and I talk about this in my book. I tell the story. Talking to this guy, Steve, so his initial goal was to run his big purpose was to run his former boss out of business. He did that, and then for the last 11 years, I said, "Well, what's been your motivation for the business?" And he was like, "I don't know, pay the mortgage." And so, but the ripple effect in his business was staff weren't motivated. They kind of showed up for the paycheck. The quality was down, performance was down, everything. And when we changed it to start to say, okay, the purpose here is, becoming best in our industry, best in class. It is innovation. It is a program to give back to the community. As we changed and created purpose, the results of staff staying longer, working harder, quality going up, financials getting better, everything in the business was transformed with this idea of defined purpose. So I love that recognizing that deep sense of purpose affects your mindset, but also absolutely flows right into the results you generate in your business or in your life.
Right. So what we were saying earlier with optimism, right? It has to start at the top, right? With the leader, because that is infectious, right? And that flows down.
Gina, let me ask you about practices. Let's talk about some of the practical things people can be doing. Because I think it's nice to say, improve your mindset. And I've been to some of those big events where people are like, think positive. And then you get back in your car and you're like, I don't really know how to do that.
How?
In terms of the practice of mental performance and health, you talk about eat, move, and sleep. Those are fairly obvious. Everybody's eating every day. So how do you do those things better?
Right. So, these things are about setting your brain up so that it can learn, right, the techniques, the tools that are required in order to change itself, right? So learn a more sort of positive mindset, the basics. So eat, right? Eat, sleep, move. So eat, we know that there are certain, we've all been there. We've eaten something, maybe not so great, and then you just feel sluggish, your concentration, your focus is off, right? We know now from research that there are certain actual diets that help to improve cognitive health, and in some cases can even have been shown to slow down cognitive decline. So this is namely, the Mediterranean diet.
This isn't cheeseburgers and Cokes.
No, I'm sorry. No. In fact, right. Red meat has been shown to negatively affect cognitive functioning, but okay. Right. So being very careful with what you eat. We know there's a connection, right, between the gut and the brain. There is now this gut-brain axis, as we call it. What we eat, right, affects how we think. It affects our brain health. So being really careful with that. Sleep, I would say, is the fundamental building block of good mental health. Entrepreneurs aren't always necessarily great at this, right? And it was often thought to be almost like this, this calling card or a badge of honor if you only slept, 3 hours a night, and people would be comparing themselves. Oh, right. I only slept 3 hours. I slept 4. No. We know that in order for the brain to function well, you've got to get about 6 to 8 hours of sleep in order to, function optimally. Some people will be fine with a bit less. Some people need a bit more, but that 6 to 8 hour window. And what we know now, sort of the latest research, which I just think is so cool, it just came out last year. We know that during sleep, the brain actually cleans itself. So it's actually like this power washing of the brain happens at night that gets rid of toxins. In order for that to happen, you've got to sleep about at least 6 hours in order to get there, right? So literally, if you're not sleeping, your brain is toxic. There's junk in there. So sleep, so important. And then exercise, right? Exercise, I say, is like medication for the brain. And in fact, it is, right? Studies show that exercising just at least 3 times a week, 30 minutes, cardiovascular activity is just as efficacious for the brain as taking an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication, right? So those 3 really, really important in terms of, again, setting up the brain so that it can change.
And I think there's a progression there too, that because my experience is people go from the practice, they read something, okay, I'm going to improve my mindset. And then they turn around and they're like, I'm going to become a vegetarian. I'm going to dive into, and I see somebody mention intermittent fasting. And now all of a sudden they're sort of gone from, I was eating pizza and cheeseburgers on Monday, and by Tuesday I'm, a warrior of that. Or like, I haven't worked out, but I'm going to go run a marathon. And sometimes there's this element of not appreciating that just moving your body, whether it be yoga or walking, or that there's so many different variations, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a high intensity Peloton class to be able to improve health, or that you've got to be like, well, now I've got to do 10 hours of sleep at night and 2 hours of meditation a day. That there's I like that word, practice, of small gradual improvements. You see what works for you, and there's a learning here to figure out for you what works for you to really create that mindset environment.
Right. These, extreme, physical goals like that, we just know that they're not sustainable. Right. So what I tell my people is, how can you improve your, exercise functioning just by 1%? 1%. And I'll often, recommend to my clients who don't exercise at all, 5 minutes. Can you go for a 5-minute walk? Can you do that? Right. And then it's 5 minutes on the Peloton, but it's not, an hour every day when you haven't been exercising for the past 6 months. It's just not sustainable.
Funny enough, I have something in my calendar the team here would know. It says eat, read, squat. And it's my break to either eat something, to read something, to take a break from the demands of work. And it's squat, where literally I may not have time to work out, but I will do air squats or do something to just keep some blood flowing. And it's sort of
anything
all
helps.
Practice in a day. What about the idea of people? And I think, and I mean this in terms of your tribe, how important is the idea of like having people around you that also positively affect your mindset? Or is it just because they create an example for you, or where is that powerful?
So it's a few things. You know the saying, you're the sum of the 5 people that you spend the most time with.
Right. Is that true?
Right.
I was wondering about
that. It is true. It is true. I'm not sure if it's 5, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 6, but brings home the point that, who you have around you is important, because we know, right, that you will sort of start to think like those people, or you can start to emulate what they do, right? So have people around you, yes, who are good examples, who maybe are models of maybe what you would like to become, but also people who have your best interest truly at stake, and believe in you, because you might need to hear sometimes that you're doing great, or these are the people who are going to help you, or maybe say something to help you to keep going through really tough times, as opposed to dissuading you from continuing, right? So who you have around you is very, very important to your success.
I've always found that in sports, that if you're playing with a group of people, or like a running club where you start to run with the guys that are the people that are slightly faster, that they pull you along, right? There's really is power in that. I may have to unload 3 or 4 of my friends after this webinar.
Think about it.
What about gratitude? Is there a practice you actually have around gratitude? I think everybody knows it's important, but how do you practice that?
Yeah, so gratitude is so important, right? And we know that gratitude is also a mindset. So a little exercise I have my clients do is, for 30 days, okay, just at the end of your day, think about 3 to 5 things that you are grateful for, but not the big stuff like, oh, I'm grateful for my family, the kids. No, 3 to 5 things that you're grateful for that are very specific to that day, right? So this does one of a few things. It enables you, yes, to think a bit more positively, but also to look for the small wins throughout the day, especially when you've had a really, really tough day, right? It forces you to stretch the brain and sort of see things through a different perspective. So 3 to 5 things that you're grateful for, specific to that day. Do that for 30 days. That has been shown to increase happiness ratings by 30% after 30 days.
30 days.
It's amazing. Like that, I'll take that ROI any day, right?
Absolutely. What the other practice I found from a business owner perspective, and I got this from my longtime friend, Dean, At one point, his business, he didn't have a lot of dollars to be, throwing parties for the staff or anything. They were pretty broken a startup. But he wrote letters of gratitude and appreciation to each staff member, and now does it as a regular practice, sort of in the fall season or before the Christmas season. And he's said it's been so powerful for him to recognize his team, but also powerful when they get that, right, from him as the business owner or the boss, to say, this is why I appreciate you. Here's why I'm grateful for you. It's just been a huge thing to build culture and cohesiveness with his companies.
Absolutely, right? An employee who feels valued will do anything. We'll go the extra mile for you.
Totally. A couple of quick things that I wanted to mention this as practices. Two is I like the idea that sometimes people bite off and start things, as I mentioned, really big, right? The idea that I'm now going to hit the gym 7 days a week for 3 hours a day. I like the idea that I start with the smallest common denominator and build a habit of success, right? So that the first day, if I'm going to become a runner, is I got out of bed and I put my shoes on, check. And that's my marker, right? The next day I got out of bed, I put my shoes on and I got to the front door. The next day I got to the front door and I got out the door. But I always find that people sometimes, for me, successful people really start with habits, and they start with the smallest increment, because the failing I see with people is sometimes where they set the initial goal way too big, and then they get frustrated or they do deem it as being failure. So I like the idea that if you're going to, for the people on the webinar, look at everything you're trying to achieve and how do you break that down? I've said a great example with a client of ours who said, I really want a dream trip to Hawaii. I said, what's the first step? And they said, I don't know. I said, well, pick an island and then celebrate that decision, right? That it came back to just, but that is going to move you in the direction of things. And so I like that as a tool. Mm-hmm. I also use this idea of IVVM, which really at the end of the day is this is all mindset, because it's the idea of idealization. What do you want your business to look like, your health to look like, your relationships and family to look like? Then you move into visualization and picturing all of that in your mind. But the next two steps that I find is people then don't actually get out and verbalize that. And so I like the idea that I visualize it quietly to myself, but what happens with that is you either unconsciously start to share that, and I suddenly find myself saying it, and I think, oh, I guess I'm now publicly talking about that. But that's another great step to sort of make something come together. And then the last thing is that creates materialization of some of those things. And for me, that's been a really powerful practice or tool as well. And tying in visualization and maybe the last one of meditation, is that something, Gina, that you encourage clients to do in terms of visualizing and meditating, or how does that work into the practice?
Yeah, both. So yes, successful people do visualize their success, right? And we know this, even elite athletes do this all the time, right? Kobe Bryant used to famously do this, right? He'd go to the Staples Center, wherever he was playing, before all his teammates got there, and he would just visualize, right? Visualize his shots, not actually do them, then practice, but before actual practice, he would visualize, right? And that's why he was so successful. So if you think it, right, it is much more likely to happen, because it's almost like you're priming the brain to say, hey, if we can think it, we can do this, right? So visualization is so important for success. And then you mentioned meditation. So meditation, I talked about resilience earlier, is one of the best, and I would say fastest ways of building resilience, right? And because what it does is a few things. It teaches people how to be present focused, whereas where you have to be in order to enjoy things, right? What we were saying earlier in terms of enjoying the process. Well, in terms of enjoying the process of leadership or entrepreneurship, you have to be fully present. And it teaches mindfulness meditation teaches people how to respond better to challenges as opposed to reacting to them, right? So it introduces that really necessary small space between feeling triggered and then actioning that.
Right. I also found I had an interesting experience about a year ago, just before COVID. I was in a breakfast meeting with about 20 business people, and the meditation topic came up, and I was shocked that 13 or 14 of the 20 people present had had incorporated meditation as part of their regular practice. And the number of guys I can think of at my immediate table that said, oh, I actually meditate every afternoon for 15 minutes at the office. And I picked that up, and I can tell you in the last year, it has had a profound effect in sort of midday resetting my day and resetting my mindset. to be really, I think, powerful all the way through till 5 or 5:30 at the end of the day.
Yeah, there's a reason why, everybody at Google is trained on mindfulness meditation. Everybody at Apple, Steve Jobs is a huge proponent, right? Because we know that mindfulness breeds and builds more resilient, successful leaders.
Right. So Gina, on our last topic before we start to wrap up is, when do you need, like in terms of mindset, I think everybody wants to make improvement, but there's also places where you get to a place where you need some help, right? Whether it's just a friend in a conversation or you need professional help. But when do you know to seek that?
Yeah, so I would say, well, a couple of things. When, if there's any issues around, let's say, anxiety or self-esteem or problems with procrastination, lack of motivation, then you should probably see some professional help, right? Because all of those things might get in the way of success. We know that entrepreneurs are especially afflicted by mental illness. I'm not sure that this is even something that people know. So stats currently 20%. So 1 in 5 currently have a mental illness of some kind. The stats with entrepreneurs are much, much higher. It's about 50% in Canada. So think about that. 1 in 2 entrepreneurs currently have a mental illness. There have been some studies that have shown those numbers are actually higher. The World Health Organization, 2019, came out with a study that showed that 80% of entrepreneurs at some point in their life will have a mental illness. Okay, so right, we can sort of hypothesize all this to why this is, but entrepreneurship is stressful, right? So stress can give rise to mental illness. So it is important. I think here, I might be biased, but I think that every entrepreneur should have a good psychologist and a good coach, right? Even if they're feeling great. I work with people who are good, right? I don't just work with entrepreneurs who have mental illness. In fact, I'd say most of my clients are healthy, mentally healthy, but we work together getting them from good to great and ensuring that they stay good or ensuring that they stay great, right? Teaching them, for example, like stress management strategies like mindfulness, uncovering any maybe, sabotaging thoughts that might come into play, and I teach them how to change those thoughts, right? So I think an entrepreneur should check in with somebody around their mind health periodically, right? We take our car in for service every couple months. We get physicals, once a year. Why not have a mind check-in, right? That mindset is everything. It's so important to business leadership. So it can be really helpful, irrespective of whether or not you might be sitting with a clinical, right, issue. Really, I'd say important to check in with a psychologist, a good mental health clinician, to have that mind check-in, but that's especially true, of course, if there is any real sort of mental health issue at hand.
No, I love that. And my experience personally has been that I've had some of my best breakthroughs in talking to a counselor. I've had, I like the idea that with every business owner, particularly entrepreneurs, because it is such a stressful role to play in your career, is that you have to have an entourage, right? And this is everything from your massage therapist to your chiropractor to help you take care of your physical body. But I absolutely agree that having a counselor or a psychologist that you can turn to, not from the perspective of I'm broken, but as you said, like a lot of business leaders, high performers, you'd have that person in your corner as this sports psychologist if you and I were in a sport. Yeah. That really is part of a healthy entourage and support system for every business owner and entrepreneur. So, and it doesn't necessarily need to be down that path of I'm broken now and I really need to be fixed, but just that it really does move to top performance. And I know as a coach and an advisor, oftentimes people say, well, my business is okay, it's not broken. Well, listen, you and I both know we work with high performance people, and to get them to that next level of their success definition requires that, like I said, the maintenance or just the outside perspective.
Yeah, I tell sort of my clients all the time is, I can help you if you feel broken, but it's much easier for me to work with you to, douse a little flame as it is to put out a fire, right? So anything mental wellness related, it's no different than physical health, right? The earlier you intervene, and certainly any strategies that you can put in place that are prophylactic, right, against stress, they're going to be much more valuable to you and just, again, set you up for success. And, if you're doing great, enable you to stay great and stay
Yeah.
on top of your game.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I love that. I think the more times that we spend talking about positive mental health and just the healthiness and having that support network really does take away the stigma of that and allows more people to be like, I love the idea of being in a room full of entrepreneurs and being somebody saying, well, who's your psychologist? Right?
Yeah.
The openness of that sort of discussion to good performance, healthy business, and most importantly, just individual health for all of the entrepreneurs and business owners you and I both work with. I want to wrap things up, and to do that, I want to first off say thank you to everybody who participated. There's a couple of things that I think are really important. Gina and I, we were talking about sort of structuring this webinar, and there was so much content that we both agreed that we are going to move towards creating an online course where there may be a number of modules, sort of a 6-hour program that just speaks to how, as an individual, you can create that mindset. But as we go and start to build that out, and so stay tuned if that's something you're interested in, I want to mention a couple of offers that if you want to be able to have some conversation, certainly for Ontario residents, that you can go to pathwell.ca and do a 15-minute call with one of the people on Gina's team, one of the mental health specialists. And from my perspective, you can visit my website, martypark.com. And I'm glad to talk to you about your business, your own personal performance within the business, what you want to try to create. But Gina and I both want to be resources for our audience. And just make sure that while this sort of opens the door to you thinking about your thinking and about good mindset for success and performance in your life, it certainly doesn't need to stop here. It's going to become that thing, that practice of ongoing improvement. And I just hope that this webinar has provided that value. And so Gina, thank you so much for being my guest and my co-host on this.
My pleasure.
My last thing that I might say is just be sure to follow Pathwell or me on Instagram. And otherwise, I wish everybody some good mental health today and into the future, and lots of future success in 2021.